Hello. So today we are dancing with Caterina Daniela Mora Jara, or Daniela, Daniela, or Caterina, as I know you.
Yeah.
You are doing a PhD at Stockholm University of the Arts, and this is where we've met, so to speak. We met at the in the auditions, as part of the audition panel for the amazing choreography, an intense and emotional labor. And also we were fortunate enough to go to Oslo together for a conference where I met some of your work and stuff, and we danced together and stuff. And I think I'm very curious about where you're working and some of the topics that you're raising. So this is why I invite you, and that I would like to spend more time with you. So it's all very selfish.
Thank you, Peter. So actually the first remember that when you just put recording is that I used to do radio in relation to dance.
No.
Like 15 years ago. So I am like now having this kind of memories of what was it, what I did there. I even don't remember. But okay, that was in Argentina. So just to situate a little bit of myself, yes, I am from a small city called Fisque-Menuco in Patagonia, but also my mother is Chilean, so this is why I say that I have the two nationalities, which is also true. I do have them. So I consider myself, and when I like to present, like I like to say, I am a migrant who has the possibility to be a legal one. And also, when I started to speak in English and in French, I also like to present myself saying that it was a shock. And that happened at my 29 years old, so let's say 6 years ago, more or less. 6, 7, I don't remember exactly what is my age. So, and that was when actually I moved from Buenos Aires to Brussels.
Yes.
And in Latin America, we do not used to actually speak in English too much because we are not surrounded by like English speakers countries. So for me, that was kind of, it is always an entry point to say who I am. Yeah. So also I become very nervous when I speak in English. So you just let me know if I need to repeat something else. Okay, but yes, I started the PhD 3.5 years ago. That means that I have exactly 2 years more to finish this path. And since then, actually, I also had to move to Stockholm, which is a requirement of being somehow a civil servant of like working it's part of the requirement of living in and working in a public institution here in Sweden. The research actually started with translations, and I was super busy at that moment when I applied for the PhD with a question about how can I integrate all the struggle that I had with language in my artistic practice. And this is why I started to do translations from ballet to reggaeton. So ballet, maybe it's kind of super, I feel like also it's important for me just to define or just to give like insight of like to not give for granted when we speak about ballet, what is ballet right now? Also because it has become part of the popular culture for me. It's also, let's say, more like a popular dance rather than an elitist. Of course, there is an imaginary around, like, and I say this because not only the imaginary, but also how it circulates, and with the explosion of YouTube, this we can problematize it. Also, who can access to training of ballet, or who can access to an academy of ballet. Of course, it is full of boundaries, but as part of the social textured social tissue of how do we perceive dance, and a small, I mean, it's also a very gender thing, right? But a small child will know how to imitate forms of ballet, right? So for me, ballet is this academic dance, a classic, let's say classic, coming from a classic tradition related to monarchy in Europe, where actually the power was determined by not only the distance towards the king, but also towards the power, who was at that moment the French king, but also how that body make itself readable in relation to other bodies. So of course, you had more power if you were close to the king, but also the king was super busy with making himself open. And this is why, of course, the question about en dehors, en dehors means
open.
External rotation.
Okay.
Okay, and then like speaking.
Caterina is showing the turnout of the feet.
Yes.
The en dehors, the openness in the ballet tradition. Huh?
Exactly. And then when I moved to Brussels, I said, actually, I started to do a.pass, which is a program that it's not running anymore on artistic research. And I was busy with how Latin community is being perceived in Brussels and what does it mean or what does it do to dance reggaeton. Also because I come from quite a strong background of clubbing or going to cumbias and going to parties where I like just to be with people and sweat with people and understand what are the incredible thousands of decisions that happen in relation to the space, without light, with a lot of flirting around, with a lot of expectations around, as a space of also super problematics sometimes in terms of gender, or sometimes in terms of course of class. So all that was part of the initial project. And then at some point, because of this struggle of making myself articulated, I started to integrate that struggle into the artistic practices. So the translations from ballet to reggaeton were somehow always seen, always perceived as something non-perfect, conflictual, super pretentious, because it was like one system into another, but also like activating storytelling, because I am still busy with characters, with female characters forgotten in the history of ballet or the history also of popular culture. So that was the project that made me be accepted in this institution. and I remember quite well that the title was somehow Transatlantic Conflicted Embodiment or something like that, but conflicted embodiment was already part of that title, of the title that the one that was part of my application 4 years ago.
And can I ask?
Yeah, of course.
How has your relationship to sort of identifying as researcher, dancer, choreographer, how has that shifted maybe in the movement or the moving over to Europe?
Well, actually, at the beginning in my career, I perceived myself not only as a dancer, but mostly as a teacher.
Yes.
And then that was my first, this is my diploma, I can identify with them. I also come from a family of teachers. So all my families are whether like child professors or secondary, like college teachers.
And you were a dance teacher? Or
yes.
You did?
Yes. I also was teaching quite from my 19 years old. I just finished and then I started to teach. So for me, the class, the dance studio is where knowledge, actually, it's all the time discussed, rearranged, when it clashes, all the question, where people cry, where people smile, and where people enjoy also. Also for me, it has this power of the pedagogy, task. And then at some point when I went to Buenos Aires, because let's say that I am coming from Patagonia, which is 1,200 200 kilometers from the capital, so it's actually quite long.
Yeah.
And there are no trains. I mean, anyways, kind of okay.
So very isolated.
Exactly. When I came to the capital, I said, "Oh my God, what do I want to do in this city?" And then I was touring around several professions. Okay, tango dancer. Okay, folklore dancer, more in a professional way, because in my home, my city town, also I used to do it. Or I also actually then I started to fantasize with the idea of becoming a scholar, dance scholar, and then later, choreographer.
Yeah.
But that was, let's say, the last one. And even though I do use and I do perceive sometimes myself as a choreographer, I actually was great for me just to come here to Stockholm to actually understand that my logic, my way of approaching the world, is the logic of the dancer. Yeah. And it was a little bit for me, this I never thought about that. It was, when I say this, I was a bit in between surprised and super relieved that I found Chrysa Parkinson, who talks about that position of the dancer, like thinking the world, or in my words, this is my words of course, but like thinking the world through the dancer perspective. Yeah. And actually, there also I do have a fiction, because dancer, performer, what is the difference? I consider myself both. I did also singing. I study singing. I study actress or physical theater. Yeah, acting, physical theater. I did study a little bit of music. So, anyways, just to say that through the years, I became somehow just interested by the fact of performing. Performing again, like for an audience, with an audience. And this for me is something that makes me feel challenged all the time, anytime, in whatever space.
So then, so do you want to say where you are, or do you want to situate a little bit more, or maybe it'll come out as well?
I mean, in very short words, what emerged from this project that was busy with the translations from ballet to reggaeton, more let's say in a linear relationship, exploded right now. And now the research site is the place of the middle, the conflict in between them, and it does not only refers to ballet and reggaeton, but it invites all the practices I have done that are part of my archive. Yeah. So I am busy in this question of what does it happen in between contact improvisation and Argentinian tango. What if we put together salsa and Cunningham, or Graham and Cumbia, or Pa-Kua, which is actually martial arts thing that I have practiced, with release, or with passing through. And what if we invite, for instance, Samba? There is Samba, Brazilian Samba, the one of the carnival, but it's also there is a folklore from Argentina called Samba too, which is actually a slow dance with scarf, a small scarf. And what happens if we put together the tapping of Malambo, who is a folklore dance from Argentina, or historically done by men, executed by men, and recently by, of course, women, but this gender perspective also is a challenging thing. And what happens if we put this tapping thing together with, flamenco, which are somehow, let's say, in terms of the rhythmicity, they are quite similar. So all those problems are, let's say, the questions of the research today. And of course, there is a question specifically of how can someone from the south speak in the north?
Yeah.
And what does it do to be in the north and to shake the north? This stability that it's perceived as a value that I never encountered in my life, and that I have, the luxury of having a salary and a stability, a position. I mean, like big words.
But do I understand you? You've never met people valuing stability before?
Oh yeah. Yes, but what happens is that it seems like, for me, a way of producing it was hard to think in stability. It was just like a way of it's not a strategy to be in the world, at least from where I come from.
Yeah.
And someone who has stability, yes, of course, it has a regular salary, but it's probably not working in the art fields. I mean, it doesn't mean that it does not happen, of course, because there are professions like medicine, or there are more standard, let's say, professions. But anyhow, the political life, it's super alive, and the struggles, the economic struggles are hitting all the time. And let's say right now there is intellectual persecution in academia. And for instance, yesterday the news in the newspaper was that the university where I used to study communication in my city town, in Fisque-Venuco in the south, actually closed because there is no funding for paying the heating.
Wow.
So we are speaking about this kind of thing. So imagine no heating with -10 or this kind of, well, maybe in Patagonia is 0, but anyways, right now there is winter. So we are, and also of course how fascism and how arbitrary are being taking some decisions in relation to the cut of funding to public institutions, right? So this is the most super violent thing.
Yeah.
But coming back to the research, of course, it is a question for me of how, even though people move the direction, let's say the north, south, east, west, people move those directions while moving also themselves in the planet, I believe this. There is a question for me of what does it mean to be here in the north, speaking from the south? Could I shake something? And when I mention this, I think of the stability. What I perceive that it's not for me, it's not something bad per se. What I do believe is problematic is when this stability somehow becomes fixed and becomes like, even though of course last week there were cuttings, and we can also of course speak about that, about the precarity of the cultural sector today. There is something about being able to anyways produce, that's something that I do not come from. And that for me what is problematic is when there is a proud about how things are done here, and that proud does not allow you to be interested in other ways of doing. And this, yes, I have perceived, with a lot of love anyways for this context, but I have perceived sometimes a resistance, just because here things are stable and are grounded, and it's also perceived as a very important and pedagogic, let's say, institution, like very valuable, super, like it has a symbolic value quite high, this institution also.
The way you speak about pride as an emotion, perhaps, I have to think of Sara Ahmed and her work on emotions and how politicized they can be, and exactly how this sense of pride could perhaps cause us not to be political in a way, not to actually deal with the instability that does exist, and to sort of luxuriate and manifest a sense that everything's stable, therefore we have no need to look further or whatever. I mean, it's always very complex with Sara Ahmed, but just the way you're speaking now makes me evoke that sort of sense of, this emotionality of the north, maybe.
Fully yes, and also because, at least for me, the European model, and of course the Nordic education model, was the model, is the model. It's like when people want to refer about academic standards or educational standards, we look into the Nordic context.
Yeah.
So there is also, this is when I mentioned that I'm interested in shaking. It's because about creating space for expectations to maybe crack, to maybe. I'm not interested in super fully saying this is wrong, because I actually do not believe in good or bad or right or wrong. It's just how actually, what does it do? This amount of discourse that I hear here about the correctness, about the good research, about the right things to do. And then, of course, this is because I think there is something super, super attached in the way of perceiving knowledge that it's related to the good thing, the correct thing, the proud of that also. So just so to come back again and reiterate, I think for the ones who are maybe lost and maybe also my pronunciation, I always try to be very, 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 very clear.
You've got your radio voice on.
Yes, exactly, the radio voice. No, but yes, it's this question of how to shake the north through the south that at least I am interested in.
Yeah.
And it doesn't mean that I only represent the South. Of course, for my colleagues working in Argentina, I am the most north.
Yes.
So it's also that is tricky. How do we position ourselves and how that changes in relation to where we are and to whom we are speaking with.
So how are we going to do this?
Yes.
Practically.
So I thought, and I proposed right now 2 exercises. There will be one about shaking. Yeah. It's in relation to how I experience the work of fascia related in Argentina, and it's coming from an osteopath called Andrea Manso. And I actually was a bit shocked of coming here and having only quite soft experiences in relation to fascia. So my proposal will be not that. It will be just to shake it and just to activate it.
And just to be clear, fascia is this tissue in the body which is all over the body, everywhere.
Exactly, and that the most important, that this for me in terms of how does function the imaginary around fascia is that is the tissue that interconnects. And we have fascia all over around all the tissues, and of course it's different. And it's also interesting that it's a system quite recently somehow discovered and put into a specific lens of study. So this is as for fascia. And then for the second one, we will try to evoke a little bit, a little glimpse of the practice related to conflicted embodiment, which is the let's say the current ongoing research I am busy with. Okay. So, as for the first, let's go to the space.
Yeah. Well, let me pause and then I have a clearer thing. So we will go pause and we'll do the shaking the fascia, and then we can come back and describe the next one.
Yes, of course.
Oh, wow. Maybe we can recap a little bit what we did, because some things came up which were really interesting. So there was the anatomy of the fascia, the anterior, which is the front, the posterior, which is the back, and the lateral, which is the sides or the cross across the thing. And we were with the anterior for one whole song, and then the posterior, and then the lateral. And also just, you spoke a lot about, also during, about the anatomy of the body and the translation of that and so on.
Yeah.
There's so much to talk about, but I guess we go straight into the second, or?
As you want. Just maybe to clarify, I have to also recognize my ignorance towards a specific anatomy. So I work with Ima, like, okay, open it up, what does it do when I think in the posterior, right, in the back, the fascia in the back, like, what does it open as imaginary? Like, I mean, where is the limit of my back? Can my back go until my face? And also the question about intensities, when I bring this up of shaking, is it shaking sometimes linear, or what happens if I try to do a circular shaking, or what happens with the minimum scale of shaking, and what if I go towards a maximum, like somehow a scale of shaking, and what happens if I am shaking with the weight in only one leg or with the hand on my floor? How actually the fixed point makes me or helps me to find other ways of shaking that I have not, like, somehow experienced. I am super full of these questions because I am interested in reggaeton. And reggaeton is like, okay, mostly the perreo. Perreo means doggy dance style, which of course it has this sexual connotation, but it's also political because it was censored and persecuted by some government. So all this, okay, this is super interesting. I was not going to enter into it. It's just like, okay, how do we activate also dance for me? Only that. And
No, absolutely. Okay, so part 2.
Yes, part 2. Okay, so for this one we will do it in silence, and the idea is somehow to have a glimpse of the practice of conflicted embodiment, mostly in relation to what and like how I have experienced my dance learning context, and how was for me inscripted, how my body created inscriptions, marks, choreographies in it only through the repetition, through this strategy of copying, and trying just to be together or imitate whether my teachers or my fellows. And for me, what it's key somehow is the idea of the DJ. I like to still like defend like what I do. It's actually I am putting together something that already exists, which epistemically actually means that I am not doing anything new. And having that pressure out of myself, I think it's my way of understanding not only pedagogy but not only performing arts, but also a way of being in the world. Like I can only bring another point of access to things that are already there. So with this idea of the DJ, who is the one who is mixing, who is the one who is jumping in between each other, which is transforming from one music. One is like what happens before transformation, that I recognize another song, but it's not yet that song, and it's another song. And when does it happen, transformation? What is like, how much can I hold that moment of not knowing? When does it become boring if no one understands the song I am playing?
Yes.
Like how much it becomes abstract, and the question of like the movement, like let's say the modernistic movement of the movement by only per se, like on the movement for the movement itself, right? How much if I become, let's say, too modernistic in my way of performing, I become elitist. I start to be like, people start to read also contemporary dance history only through the fact that I am doing, for the lack of a better word, like weird things, And what happens if, I can recognize that. So the practice actually takes that idea of the DJ as a way of body DJing, let's say, body DJing, I don't know. I like to think in the place and how actually those combinations happens in a virtuosic way, just because I have been training this so much.
Yeah.
And how actually the conflict in between those different dance traditions are erased only because I have been practicing. So, like, what happens if you don't see the conflict anymore, while at the same time the research is called conflicted embodiment? So this is one of the key topics, hot topics of the research right now. I believe still in that, in something that I like to bring, that I somehow frame it like, okay, but let's come back to this metaphor of something that can be, something that cannot be, and something that can be another thing at the same time. So the first, a second, and the third. And who actually speaks about that is Silvia Rivera Cusicanqui. I mean, it's also coming from the word and the colonial approach, and questions about mestizaje, this idea of the mestizo, who is one thing, who is not the thing, and who is another thing as a third thing. I mean, I explain it much more better in the book than the booklet. If you are interested in it, you can just send me an email and I can send the PDF. It's important to mention that. It's also a text that is circulating, so I think I hope it is possible to find it. Now we are going to practice it, and in order to practice it, we are actually going to remember and to have an exercise of coming back to our dance learning context, and how actually that frames a specific way of looking into the body, and a specific way of resisting this idea of error, or a specific way of copying each other's, because sometimes copy is like, okay, you have to copy the original, let's say, the teacher, but sometimes that value, it's not always like that, because, for instance, when you are in a session, in a hip hop session, I mean, it's like how much you can actually put from yourself, from your embodiment, that actually demarks your difference. So it's also like this idea of how repetition activates the same and the other. And
this relates to the can be, cannot be, and cannot be the same as, at the same time as, or? Yes,
of course, fully. And also, I mean,
I'm just trying to navigate everything you're bringing.
And just to say it like, I mean, for me, out loud, this research comes from having fun in clubs a lot. So it's actually tries to bring again back this joy, this pleasure of the social dancing, where sometimes also, and often actually, at least from where I come from, is also related to a spiritual set of mind, of like dancing as a way of living, and it's there all the time, and it doesn't mean that I grow up dancing all the day. It doesn't mean that. It's just like, it means like in the parties, people stay, and that stay long time. I stay 3 a.m., 5 a.m., and like I have this kind of family memories of me going to bed and my uncles keeping the dance floor alive. So this sensation. So now we are going to come back to the space. When we are already into space, but just like to the space without props, let's say, and we will practice that.
I have one question,
Yes.
maybe before we go in. So, I think it's clear. So it's a sort of, we will be copying one another. And I had like maybe a technical question of like, when do you change track? You know, like in a DJing format, like you play the track, and yes, there's like maybe it's not understood, or it's like everyone's like, yeah, this track, this tune. That's even a question for DJs. How do they choose when to fade out and to fade in with the next?
Well, and then you are exactly asking about, let's say, the power of the performer as author. When the performer is so skilled that actually can make decisions on the composition of it. In other words, improvisation, right? But or instantaneous composition, right? But it's just like exactly that. And then it's a vibe that you feel it when people start to, I don't know, maybe leave. People start to look at the other side. People start to look at the phones. Like it's something that it's in the air. It's hard to. I think the most interesting part of this is that there is no recipe. It's the recipe that each performer, each dancer needs to develop as a skill, as a way of reading what is happening in the air, in the space, in that vibe, in that specific moment, with that light, with those people, with this audience, in this context.
Great, that's clear. Let's make a dance floor.
Yes, but just to clarify, we are not going to copy each other. We are going to remember, and then we will activate those memories of previous dance education, and then we will start to mix it. And just to clarify, this is somehow a 3 days workshop. So what we are going to do now is somehow really like jumping into the exercise. And I am very sorry if it's just too fast, but let's try it.
Okay, let's try. Remember some of our dances. Okay, so maybe we can do as we did before, and just recap maybe some of the details.
So we spend just right now like 25, something like that, minutes on one ongoing process, one ongoing task, where at the beginning I invited Peter to remember and to activate that memory of a previous dance learning process. And I still feel I am slowing down because I still feel that I am in this teaching mood. So, and then what happens there is that I somehow give quite a lot. I try to not overwhelm, of course, the participants, but for this we dedicate at the beginning one hour, right? Just to remember, visualize, and then what happens with this when this visualization takes over the body, and then the idea is to embody those different dance.
This is where the form and the embodiment come into play, right?
Exactly, and then there is this question of, okay, does it help you if you position yourself into a form, if you choose a form of that? Like, do you remember better? Or is it a way of access? Or what happens is if you actually, through the sensation, you activated that embodiment. Do you need to match form and sensation? Or like, how do you nourish that process? And also something that I really actually learned through the workshops that I have facilitated, it's that it is already part of the process to jump from one dance learning context or performing arts learning context or formal context to another one. And also this has been a discussion, a super discussion of what a learning process is. Yeah. I mean, it's a hot topic of the research right now. Also how actually we are so used to think in formal education process, but how to actually bring back processes learning processes that were part of a family, and like you performing for the family. I mean, that was of course a performance practice. So then of course there is also this question of how to navigate from one to another one. And then since I have a fully time dedication for this, I became quite obsessed, completely immersed into this question of, okay, how many embodiments? I mean, what does my body embody? And what if how to train this? How to go from one context to another, or what happens with different dance tradition? I mean, how to make them appear? I mean, of course, ballet is the most legible one. For me personally, it has been the one that has marked my embodiment the most. But it does not mean that singing or martial arts are not part of it. And the great thing is just to have them as part of that world where I can jump and make them available. And then of course we are not right now for today, this is something that we are not even mentioning, but being seen, it's also very super big part of the research. All the training that I have and I propose with the gaze. Because when I am performing for others, with others in the space. So also that informs a lot of the decisions I do in that time while practicing this.
While we're there, can I ask about legibility then?
Yeah.
In terms of performing, because this practice for me was so. Now we're going into reflection, but this practice for me was so. Even if I was using form to reconnect with the embodiment or the sensation of that embodiment, it was very subjective.
Yeah.
So how does I think I'm answering my own question as well. I'm also recognizing that, of course, certain contexts, they carry performativity and they carry a need to, or not a need to, but an embodied recognition of presenting a form or presenting a sensation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think for me,
I guess I'm asking about conflict, actually.
Yes, because the part of the research is, the research is about conflicted embodiment.
But in specifically the conflict of presenting things which maybe wouldn't necessarily have been presented.
Yeah. I think there I am interested in opacity, actually. But I have to be aware that legibility plays a role. Another thing that was mentioned in my last PhD seminar was also the difference between literacy and legibility. Mm-hmm. So Sandra Noeth, who was my opponent, mentioned that the difference in between, and I think it was during the seminar or during the I don't remember now exactly when, but if my memory doesn't treats me, she mentioned something that legibility, it's actually related to having a meaning to be understood. So there is a meaning to be read, to be understood. While literacy actually, I don't remember exactly what, but while literacy actually, it's oh my god, this part you can edit it, but we can study for later.
But it's also nice to see just how complex and how many concepts you're trying to figure through this. One thing that I was thinking about when you spoke about learning, I had to think of cognitive learning, which, if I understand it right, now I will do the failing of remembering concepts or the research behind concepts even. But cognitive learning is where we learn through, we think we know what we are seeing or experiencing, I suppose, and we're trying to meet our perception of what we think we're experiencing with the memory of it, and it's in that meeting that we start to learn the differences that
new
exist.
Patterns.
Exactly, and we generate new patterns, which generates new knowledge.
Yeah.
Because of the memory, the remembering aspect of this practice, I had to think of cognitive learning as
I mean, I am not specialized in cognitive learning,
No.
from pedagogy and also from development of knowledge and the child, of course, how child uses fiction actually and how child actually uses mimicry and copying. It's exactly for the reason that you just mentioned. I mean, in order to make new patterns, you have references and you use those references as a way of creating new connections. And this is also from another point of view, I am who I am because of my references. And this is, of course, from feminism, this is why also I mentioned nothing is new, because but it's already there, it's only a new perspective, it's another entry point. What actually I am interested into the practice is to review learning dance context or performing art context, is to actually make them available, is to actually politicize education, politicize curricula, and also to, of course, somehow propose a way in which we can actually find new things, maybe in traumatic experience or maybe super pleasurable experience, and make another thing out from that. So actually, this is when I mentioned it's nothing new. I mean, I defend this way in where I position myself as part of the tissue of my teachers, the students, the context, the spaces,
And to jump on the curricula element, I want to actually jump back to the first warm-up exercise, the shaking, because I had to think about how anatomy, of course, is a very Western construction. The way we name the body, and fascia is actually a great example of how limited, because when they were dissecting the body, taking out the parts, they had all this fascia and they were like, oh, this excess, and they would just bin it, oh no, it's just it was not a part of the body. It had no function. They wanted to get to the singular organ or the singular muscle, not its tendon and its interconnectedness. And so I had to think of that because of course you're using anatomy. You're talking about the hamstring, you're talking about fascia, you're talking about front and back, and you're saying but not oppositional, but still directed through these things. And maybe I could even tentatively connect to using genre or aesthetic or context as a placeholder, as like a map, I wanted to say sort of cartography of something. And just because it's in the room for me a little bit, because of the first exercise, I want to ask about trauma.
Yeah.
And what role is that playing in the conflicted embodiment, in the practices you're working with? Because shaking is famously used to release trauma, often from interconnected tissue or tissues of all sorts, but sometimes with the fascia. And then, of course, because the word conflict in embodied conflict, I'm also curious to what and where the conflict is coming from.
Yeah.
And if I could add one more thing, sorry, I have so many thoughts and things.
It's fine.
In the shaking, there is something about resistance. And I feel like you were alluding to, and as maybe starting to ask myself, can I shake without initiation? There's something about shaking where I need something to push against, even my own body. I'm using it as a resistance, as an object to shake against. And I felt like you were also providing the possibility that I could be shaking in opposition to shaking, which was phenomenal. I couldn't. It was very interesting. So trauma, criteria or curriculum, and cartography, and
So many things. A ver. As for trauma, I think. So first of all, I am not a therapist. So this is what it's important to mention is like maybe the practice has some implications in relation to processing trauma, but the way in which we does it is through the practice. So for me, like it's important to defend, let's say, like the power of the practice, and also be very aware that it can help, but. And of course, when the room becomes super vulnerable or very fragile, it's my role, and I have to be able to host that fragility and those situations. So this, of course, but of course, I am not specialized in therapy. So this is one thing. For me, very particularly, it has been, of course, a way of looking into my own experience, into my super normative dance education, where I grew up, like completely worried about the failure of my body, the failure of how I moved, how I actually learned, the failure of the place where I was born, the failure of the expectations of what should I expect as me as a dancer, because from a very early age, I decided to not become a tango professional dancer. So all this, also this nationalistic failure expectations. So we can of course continue, but just to say that there is a lot of norms that a dancer, student incorporate, interiorize, as a way of subjecting that body into a dance learning context, into a performing art context. So there are a lot of norms, and it does not have to be only in a conservatory that this happens. It does not only be. So this is in relation to trauma. As for the cartography, actually there it becomes super important, the question about conflict, the conflicted embodiment, because in what I am interested, it somehow is into stay with the trouble. It's like it's an stay with the trouble, as Donna Haraway might say. Like it's a stay with the trouble concept. For me, actually, since I am not also native English speaker, I even will say that I do not understand what embodiment means. Specifically literally in translation, there is no one only word that I could somehow fit in the translation of embodiment. And even myself also, while I am talking, I hear myself all the time making mistakes in my language. So just to say that the way in which I approach the concept as such, it's also somehow welcoming all the frictions and the tensions in the acts of embodiment.
Yeah.
Does it make a reply that?
It does. I mean, and it's sort of, there's a few things. It centers dance practice as well, which is, it's interesting that you say that, of course, I mean, I think also for me as a native English speaker, embodiment is slightly ambiguous, but I can understand if there is no equivalent word, you feel even more sort of at sea. But it centers a little bit dance as a form in its broadest sense. Yeah. Or it begs us to ask the question, like, where does it exist? And in relationship to memory and maybe memory versus trauma, you know, there's that sense of now I forget where the reference is coming from, but that a lot of physical trauma I've heard it once said that some of the physical trauma is often produced pre-verbal, that it's more likely to be situated in the body. That's it. Through authentic movement practice, I heard that it's a very good therapeutic practice for people with pre-verbal trauma. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And it sort of makes sense to use dance as a therapeutic practice. And so. But there's something very biopolitical in this work. And what's interesting is the complexity that arises in the work, because you say, can I remain in conflict as I become practiced in this embodiment? Mm-hmm. And yet your positionality is in relationship to this north-south transition, and all the real racist and sort of hierarchical and dominatory, or whatever we want to call it, problems that are situated in there. They're very real. Mm-hmm. However, it seems with the work, it also becomes just very complex.
Yeah.
Sort of.
I mean, in what I am interested is like to look into identity politics with a strategy that does not reinforce those categories, but rather allows us to think in movement, in transition, in transformation, in conflict about it. I mean, let's I don't know if it makes sense sometimes, but I think it's, for me, I aim for the research, actually, it's to be a strategy of dealing with topics, of course, related to identity politics, because who I am dancing moves, of course, all my identity and those categories. But at the same time, I am interested in creating a vocabulary where those categories can actually make me think without reinforcing a stereotype.
No, exactly.
Let's hope for that.
And I mean, and in it you also say, like, being in the Swedish context or the Nordic context or whatever, or the northern context, a wish to shake the stability that is perceived and so on. And I wonder how that manifests. There's within this complex terrain, exactly, of not trying to produce stereotypes, there is also this opening then that the political subject, the biopolitical subject, maybe I would like to maybe also add into our conversation, especially in relation to this geopolitical conversation.
Yeah.
The biopolitical subject is somehow an intersubject. The complexity that arises through dealing with the memory of context, the embodiment of context, and the fragility or the reality, the materiality of the context embodied is vastly more complex than the simplified Nordic southern divide. Oh, sorry.
Yes, and I mean, and this is why I speak about like somehow complexifying for me embodiment and somehow taking care of technique of traditions, but at the same time reflecting on what do we need today in a curricula for a dancer, right?
Yeah.
Or how do we actually make a space for bringing pain, concept as uncomfort, comparison, like comparative things that we used to do when we are in a dance class. Like, I mean, how to speak about that. Yeah.
It's near to 5. This is why.
So we have the door several times.
But maybe we could speak before we are kicked out.
Yeah.
Maybe we could speak a little bit about, because I completely, it's fascinating. It's so rich and beautiful, and it's really staying in the problem, maybe, as you say.
I hope.
But in the experiencing, I was like to speak of this because it was so intense to move to do that switching at the end, from like we were switching from one context to another and seeing if we can do that, and then you also invited a slow transition, and I was moving between things which I thought were very close and then finding nuances, things that I thought were extremely different and finding similarities, and I was finding the lack of need of form as much as the need of form, and how they differ, and how also I could remain in one form and transition and just change the sensation.
Yes.
Things like this. It was really rich and exciting and very generous.
All that plus the audience, the space, the light, the sound. I mean, when I perform, it's exactly that, plus taka taka taka.
Yeah.
And sorry, I interrupt you, but
No.
I get excited because you are describing what do you experience when I perform.
Yeah, I mean, and I wondered, I wondered of your experience, like, and how it was for you today, and so on. For me at the moment, it feels so precious.
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't want to perform it.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? I wouldn't want to challenge it or to have it contaminated with trying to present it in a specific way and so on. So, because one aspect of it was the staying with, which was really important, just staying with the two contexts or the one context and really figuring it out. How is that, the staying with for you?
Yeah. Well, for me, for instance, today I actually visited martial arts that I have done and Cumbia, that also I have done a lot, but I only stayed with these two. And I think sometimes when I do again for myself this kind of exercise, I somehow like so much just to keep it as less as possible. And I always discover the rhythm, the sound, the imagine, my texture in the movement. what you mentioned about, like, yes, it feels like so precious that you wouldn't dare like just to expose it. It's because there is also a work there to be done in relation to gaze and the centrality of vision in this practice. But this is for another chapter of another podcast. Because actually that is for me like what nourishes, of course, the performance.
Yeah. I mean, obviously you can use sort of titled practices like you just did now. Salsa, ballet, la la la. Does the performance ever become a learnt context that you find yourself revisiting?
Yes.
And is that not very complex?
It is super complex, but the structure of the research, it is in a triadic way. It has the performance practice that informs the workshop practice informs the performance practice, but also the writing practice, it's there, and it's also informing the workshop and the performance. So I have like this, otherwise I become super centralized in one of them. And I have managed so far at this moment of the research to actually keep track on the three of them and how the three of them contaminates each other.
We have so much to talk about. If people want to meet your work, there's the book. I will also, maybe I can even link to something. If you have the PDF online, I can link to it.
Yeah, sure.
People can find your like a way of contacting you from, of course, the university website. Okay, so we were kicked out, so the sound has changed. But what were we saying? People are able to find you at the Escojo website.
Yeah, and I can also send, as I told you, the PDF on this booklet that I have in my hand.
It's called Conflicted Embodiment, Notes from Dancing on Both Sides of the Atlantic.
Great.
This was such a pleasure. I don't think there is actually so much more to say, but unless you have one thing or two things or...
No, thank you very much, Peter. Thank you for the invitation. Yes.
Thank you. I hope that we can do it again and we see where you've arrived and so on. It's so rich, and I really encourage people to follow you in your PhD because...
in my Instagram that I don't have.
But no, in this PhD, because this work will be disseminated in many ways, and hopefully.
Yes, we hope.
And the book is just one, and we will have the PDF to that in the description.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. And this is another publication where actually here for you maybe. It's have you met a.pass in Brussels?
No, it's a publisher.
It's a.pass was actually a postmaster and also a research center. And then there is one article there about how do we use, for instance. How do we use today archive that is colonial and that is demarked by like gender, white, Eurocentered positions. So I actually try to speak about that.
Great. Yeah, I see. So you wrote this book as well with some other
with other people. We were a lot.
Nice.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Please.
I'll stop the recording now.
Yeah.
Maybe this is the thing you do after the outro.
Yeah. And I will send you the links for the music that we listened.
Here's the practicality.